Hello, welcome. I'm Julian Brooks, Senior Curator of Drawings of the J. Paul Getty Museum and a specialist in Italian Renaissance drawings.
And I'm Fred Plotkin, lover of everything Italian and specialist in Italian opera, classical music, food, and wine. And Julian and I have the pleasure of welcoming you today to a talk we call Nourishing Genius, Food and Wine in the Time of Michelangelo. And with this, we plan to time travel back to the Renaissance and specifically to Michelangelo's life to discover him through his drawings and through some of the food and wine that he loved.
And this virtual talk and tasting is a part of the Drinking in the Past series, which takes its inspiration from Getty collections and Getty exhibitions. And in this case, from our exhibition, Michelangelo, Mind of the Master. So let's meet Michelangelo. And this is a drawing that I love. It's by Daniele da Volterra, made about 1550 when Michelangelo was about 75 years old. And I think we're just so lucky to have a portrait of Michelangelo made by one of his closest friends. Daniele was at his deathbed when he died. In his later years, he was a very close friend. Michelangelo supplied him with drawings. And Daniele, was an incredibly accomplished artist in his own right and made this study of Michelangelo and just provides us with a real glimpse into what he was like. Fred, what do you see when you look at this drawing?
Well, I see someone who's tired, tormented, pensive. There's a wonderful Italian word, pensieroso, which means deep in his thoughts. And he certainly was. And I think Daniele's achievement in this drawing is that he reflected the fact that Michelangelo must have always been deep in thought. And one thing, Julian, I wonder, was he thinking, how did I get that broken nose? What's the story of the broken nose?
Yeah, it's very prominent, and Michelangelo was conscious of it right to the end of his life. He died age 88, almost made it to 89 years old, and carried that broken nose all through his life. And it happened when he was a student, when he was a youngster, and he was studying and learning as they often did at that time by studying the old masters of their age. And he was in Santa Maria della Carmine in Florence, looking at frescoes by the earlier Florentine artist Masaccio. And Michelangelo got into some sort of argument, we don't know quite what, with the sculptor Pietro Torrigiani. And Torrigiani punched him on the nose. And this is how Michelangelo got his broken nose. But we get a sense that Michelangelo was a rather sort of pugnacious, argumentative type. We know him through about 300 letters from his lifetime sent to his father and his nephew in Florence. And they really give an extraordinary picture of Michelangelo as a person, as a character.
There was an adjective that was often ascribed to him, terribilità, which means terribleness, but not the way we would say it now. Rather, it means a certain kind of forbidding, imposing, overwhelmingly testy and high-strung. Some might say intense is a good word. And he certainly did have that. I thought I would tell you a bit about his background. He was born in a small town called Caprese near Arezzo, which belonged to Florence. And his father was the podestà, which means sort of the local administrator for the Florentine Republic. Caprese belonged to Florence. We should remember that Italy, for most of its history, was not a united entity. Under the Roman Empire, it was, and then after 1861, it was. But for most of its history, it was a collection of city-states and duchies, such as Florence, Venice, Milan, as well as what we call the Papal State, ruled by the Vatican, which was based in Rome. And the ruler of the Papal States was the Pope. And believe it or not, Michelangelo's life overlapped with 13 popes. And his family moved back to Florence when he was a baby. And when he was a little kid, he was sent out of Florence because, believe it or not, they had pandemics then too, and there was a pandemic. And he was sent up to a small town called Settignano. And he lived with a family of stonecutters. And they put a hammer and chisel in his hands, and that, plus genius, is how he developed his skills to cut and sculpt marble and stone. And when he came back to Florence after the pandemic, his talents were recognized early, and he came to the attention of the ruler, Lorenzo de' Medici. And when Michelangelo was 13, he lived with the Medicis, and he learned from the artists and scholars in their court, and he also dined at their table. Interestingly, and I'll get back to their table later, at this table was Lorenzo's son Giovanni, who became Pope Leo X, and Lorenzo's nephew, Giulio, who became Pope Clement VII. Both of these popes employed Michelangelo to do huge projects, and they all knew each other as kids at the Medici table. So, Julian, tell us about Michelangelo in terms of his drawings and some of what's contained in the exhibition you have at the Getty.
Yeah, it's for me, it's such a wonderful thing to have the drawings that we have by Michelangelo. I mean, every single thing he did, from the David to the Dome of St. Peter's in Rome, was driven by drawing and rooted in the drawings that he made. One of the things that comes through from the letters that we have is just how protective Michelangelo was about his drawings, how he was almost paranoid about other artists seeing them, about his ideas being stolen. And it's really, he's the letters to his father, to his nephew, he sort of begs them not to show the drawings to other people. He's conscious of them falling into the wrong hands, as he would see it. He, in fact, destroyed a lot of his drawings throughout his life to make sure that that didn't happen. And he had a very peculiar relationship to his drawings, different to many other Renaissance artists. For an artist such as Raphael, Andrea del Sarto, the drawings were very much a part of the studio apparatus and were used by students and pupils. For Michelangelo, he didn't really have that. He didn't really have a workshop as such. And the drawings were incredibly personal. As part of his working process, the drawings were vital to him. But then once he had done with them, he was done with them. So he often destroyed them. So we know that even after painting the Sistine Chapel ceiling, for instance, there were a lot of drawings and transfer cartoons left in Rome. And he had moved back to Florence. He wrote to his assistant in Rome, Leonardo Salaio, asking Salaio to destroy these drawings and to burn them. And Salaio writes back and saying, it will be done. And we know that this happened through his life in the 1520s, 1530s. Patrons write to him saying, people like Isabella d'Este and the Marquis of Mantua, the rather manipulative poet Pietro Aretino, wrote to him saying, Michelangelo, please, send me some of the drawings that you so easily convey to the flames, that you give to the flames. And Michelangelo never did. He destroyed these drawings, but he didn't want them in circulation. And so we're lucky to have the 600 or so that we have, which are probably a fraction of what he produced. It's been estimated that if Michelangelo made just one drawing a day for every day of his working life, there would probably be about 28,000 drawings surviving. Instead, we have 600. And we have 28 of them in this exhibition, Michelangelo, Mind of the Master. And it's such a privilege to work with them. And they really feel like, Fred, you talked earlier about time travel and going back in time. And for me, I feel the drawings absolutely do that. And, if we look at one of them, for instance, this study of a seated male nude, and you have the torso, which is made in very highly worked red chalk with white chalk heightening. And then yet the toes, there's this shift where you have these so-called pentimenti, these small changes where Michelangelo is just studying the way the toes articulate. And then the head and the arm are less highly finished than the torso. You know, it also contains these tiny little clues of how Michelangelo is using the drawings himself. So there are little notes to himself. For instance, you can see under the arm here, this little squiggle, which is just a note to himself. And we now don't know what he was trying to say to himself. You know, was he saying, raise the arm, lower the arm, think about what you see through the gap here? Just this little squiggle that brings us close to the artist that as we time travel. And Fred, you and I actually met through Michelangelo nearly 20 years ago. And we met when I was working at the Ashmolean Museum, and you came to see the Michelangelo drawings that we had there. And I think that you've seen every single drawing that exists by Michelangelo, which I certainly haven't.
Guilty as charged. Not only have I seen every drawing, I've seen every sculpture, I've seen every little thing he carved. There's a story behind this. When in 1964, when I was 8 years old, we in New York City had the World's Fair, and First Lady Jacqueline Kennedy miraculously arranged to have the Mona Lisa, Leonardo's Mona Lisa, come to Washington, and Michelangelo's Pietà from the Vatican come to New York for the World's Fair. And most kids who went to the World's Fair would have wanted the corn at the Nebraska Pavilion and the waffles at the Belgian Pavilion, both of which were next to the Vatican Pavilion. I wanted to know why people were lined up to go into this little pavilion to see one thing, and it was the Pietà. And as an 8-year-old, I was just astonished by the luminescence of the marble, the lifelike faces, the details, the emotion, the veins on Christ's hand, the sorrow in his mother's face combined with a certain resignation, all of that done in marble. Now, I didn't have that vocabulary when I was 8, but I was deeply moved by what I saw. And I said to my dad, I want to go back to the World's Fair. And I didn't want those other things. I just wanted to see that Pietà again and again and again. And at a certain point, it had to go back to Rome. And I was inconsolable until my father told me it safely arrived back in Rome. And then he said to me, you know, if you like Michelangelo so much, his works don't travel. You're going to have to go to Italy and France and other places, Belgium, where these works exist, the sculptures, the buildings he designed. I later wound up going to St. Petersburg in Russia to see a sculpture. And wherever they are, the few paintings, some of which are in London, many in Florence, and of course, ceilings in the Sistine Chapel in Rome, I had to go see that. And then, Julian, as you said, the drawings tell us more. So I then wanted to see all the drawings. And every extant thing, to my knowledge, by Michelangelo that he put his hand to, I have seen and in many cases touched, which is remarkable to me. One of the more prosaic things that he created, probably not for a work of art, he once wrote out a shopping list for his assistant, apparently, to go to the market. You know, either his assistant couldn't read or maybe the food sellers couldn't read, but he wrote out what he wanted. And then in most cases, he drew what he wanted. So he wanted bread, he wanted wine, he wanted one herring. Who knows why one herring? Spinach, soup, salad, anchovies. This begins to tell us what he liked. He wanted stewed fennel. And another thing he wanted was tortelli pasta. Now, as I said, Michelangelo liked these foods. They're a little more basic, but he nonetheless dined at the great tables of Tuscany, the Medicis, and the papal tables, where there was a lot more abundance of meat, fruit, vegetables, grains, wines, anything available would have been available to these diners and to Michelangelo. But there was a lot of things that we associate with Italian food that were not at these tables. Remember his dates. He was born 1475, he died 1564. We know about the 4 sailings from Spain made by Christopher Columbus from Spain to what we now call the Americas. These were done between 1492 and 1506. And the consequences of Columbus in the Americas are highly fraught for many reasons. But there was one notable result, and it's what food scholars call the Columbian Exchange. This exchange is about the food products and animals that Columbus brought from Europe and Africa to the Americas, and from the Americas back to Europe. So among the things that he brought to the Americas, imagine food in North America without it, were wheat, coffee, which were brought to South America, bananas, cattle, pigs, olives, and vitis vinifera, which are wine grapes. Imagine this hemisphere without wine in California, Oregon, Chile, Argentina, and elsewhere. But it's also important to point out that Columbus brought extraordinary products back from the Americas to Europe. Just to name a few: potatoes, tomatoes, corn, peppers, chocolate, vanilla. Imagine European cuisine, and especially Italian cuisine, without these foods. It's inconceivable. So what this means is that food on the Italian peninsula changed radically during Michelangelo's lifetime. I'm going to give you a few examples. Polenta, which dates back to ancient Rome and was called pulentum, had been made with millet. When corn arrived on the Italian peninsula, it gradually replaced millet as the grain that we use to make polenta. Gnocchi, the little dumplings that we know so well, were once all wheat. The Roman Empire was full of wheat. But when potatoes arrived on the Italian peninsula, gradually gnocchi evolved to be made of primarily potatoes. Tomatoes were introduced later, so we probably did not see tomatoes much in Michelangelo's time. They were there, but they were thought to be poisonous, and people stayed away from them. And interestingly, chocolate, in Tuscany specifically, was not a beverage, it was not a candy, but it was used as in powdered form as sort of a spice or a flavoring, so that when you would slow cook wild boar in red wine, they would add powdered chocolate, and that made the food intense in a very pleasing way, at least to me. I've tasted it a couple of times. I think it's fair to say that Michelangelo saw food and drink more in terms of sustenance than pleasure. Some of us live to eat. I would say that he ate to live so he could get back to his art. And his typical diet was bread, cheese, olive oil, some fish, spinach and other greens, and fruit. He loved fruit, especially pears. And when he wanted to give a special gift to someone, he would have a box made with 33 pears. 33 for each year in the life of Christ. Michelangelo, unlike many artists in his time and since then, did not travel all that much. He confined himself mostly to working on projects in Florence and in Rome, depending who was commissioning the work and depending who was Pope. He did have a vineyard south of Florence that produced a pretty good red wine that probably would have been like Chianti today, although Chianti as a denomination didn't exist yet. He made some olive oil there too, or it was made for him by the contadino, by the peasant farmer. And notably, he had a cheese cave. He loved cheese, in which he would store cow's milk cheese, but especially sheep milk cheese. And one of his very favorites was a cheese called Marzolino. In Italian, the month of March, Marzo, is springtime, and a lot of early grasses and herbs appear. And the sheep that feed on these grasses and herbs in March produce a very delicious milk that results in a very limited availability cheese. And he would keep Marzolino in his cave. And he had it always with pears. As a young man, he did spend some time in Bologna, which has some of the best food anywhere in the world. But I don't think that he really was drawn to that rich cuisine of butter, cheeses, pork, sweets. This is probably why he lived to almost 89. He would have wandered Bologna's superb food markets And they're still fascinating today. And if you know the paintings by Bologna's painter Annibale Carracci, you get some sense of the market life that Michelangelo would have seen. He went to Rome in 1497 to sculpt that famous Pietà I spoke of. And Michelangelo certainly dined at the tables of the various popes that he knew. And we might think that they would dine in a more austere way, but they actually ate rather lavishly and very, very well. Even if he preferred simpler things, there was a lot of fat and a lot of salt in Roman food, and especially at the Vatican table. And therefore, he often would have white wines that were delicate, thinner, and so on, meant to contrast with these rich, fatty foods that were at the Roman and salty foods at the Roman table. Now, Michelangelo lived to almost 89, which was incredibly rare at that time and still a good age now. And he had relatively few health issues, but one that we know of was kidney stones. And to deal with this, he often went to a spa called Fiuggi, Fiuggi, that still exists today, to take the waters, which were said to be very good for people with kidney stones and other kidney problems. He had the Fiuggi water transported to Rome, so he drank it in his home in Rome. I should say that Michelangelo moved to Rome for the last time in 1534, and he lived there for 30 years without ever going back to Florence. Now, Rome, Florence is no big deal, but he only lived in Rome and never saw his birthplace or his native town again. He died, was buried in Rome. He died February 18th of 1564. And then the Medicis came and stole his body and brought it back to Florence to the Church of Santa Croce, saying, in effect, Michelangelo is a Florentine and he belongs to rest in Florence. So let me show you some of the foods and wine. We'll get to the wines later, but I want to start with some of the foods that Michelangelo would have known and loved that we can still get today. For example, there are cheeses that he knew that are still made today. These are all pecorino, sheep milk cheese. This is pecorino di Pienza, which is sort of buttery, it's soft. Pienza was a town purpose-built to be a Renaissance ideal town in Tuscany by Pope Pius, hence the name Pienza. And it's very easy eating good cheese and always pleasing. He also liked Pecorino di Siena. Siena is the capital of a province, a great art town, of course. And Siena has a slightly tangier pecorino cheese, not challenging, but certainly has a little more going on, so to speak. And it goes nicely with grapes when you have the pecorino from Siena. And then there is the famous Pecorino Romano. And I want to clarify something. When we talk about Romano cheese, typically, we talk about a very granular, tangy, sometimes oppressive cheese that we grate on spicy pasta, and it's fine, it's delicious. But that's a generic word, Romano. But Pecorino Romano is also an eating cheese. It's more firm, it's a little older than the other two, but not ancient. And it has a wonderful grassy, crisp flavor. I don't know if we say crisp about a cheese, but it does for me. And you can always recognize Pecorino Romano because it has a slight green tinge. And the reason for that, it's not spoilage, it's that the sheep have fed on Roman grass. And that's translated into the cheese. We always say that cheese is milk's leap into immortality. And these are three immortal cheeses in that Michelangelo knew them. We can eat them today. We can also eat bread that he knew. So here are two. In Tuscany, they ate a bread that typically had no salt in it. Tuscan food can be savory, but somehow the Tuscans don't like salt in their bread. They're not as extravagant as the Romans who put salt in everything. So therefore, it's a plainer bread, but very tasty. It becomes a good foil for anything else you eat, whether it's pasta whether it's meat stews, or whether it's wine and cheese and fruit. Then there is the wonderful pane casareccia, and I confess I took a little bite before to taste it. Pane casareccio is Roman, and it's earthy. It has a nice, beautiful crust. It has, believe me, an incredible fragrance. And the bread itself is a lot more dense and springy and chewy, and it's perfect for sopping up all those rich pasta sauces and oils. And when you have Roman pork made with garlic and olive oil and sage and all of that, you plunge some of the pane casareccio in, and that's good eating. And then finally, la frutta. Italian fruit is just remarkable. That's all I can say about Italian fruit. Everything has a season, and Italians have a tradition of saying a little pear. I'm so obsessed. Italians have a tradition of saying a little prayer before eating the first fruit or vegetable of the season. So when you have your first pear, your first plum, your first strawberry, you say a brief prayer. And I've been praying over this basket for hours now. Among the fruits that Michelangelo would have known were peaches, le pesche, prugne, which are not prunes, but plums, prugne secche or prunes. And there are many different varieties of green and purple and black plums in Italy, and they're all delicious. Vitis vinifera, uva da tavola. Uva da tavola being table grapes, and they come in different colors and flavors. These are sort of reddish pink. And then in my local market in New York, I found Moscato grapes. Moscato grapes have a very limited season. They're from southern Italy. These are the ripest, juiciest, most succulent table grapes that you can imagine, and go beautifully with the wine, the bread, and the cheese that we're going to be sampling. And as I said, he had a particular love for pears. And this pear is called the San Martino. It's a familiar pear to many Italians. And this pear, which was his absolute favorite, is the Forelle pear. It's a red pear. It is so fragrant. I wonder if you can get the fragrance of that. It's so aromatic that part of the pleasure of eating this fruit, and this applies to wine and all foods, you don't only taste it in your mouth, you taste it in your nose. Now, there's an Italian expression, siamo alla frutta, which means we're at the fruit, which we just were. That also means that we've come to the end because we are at the end of our meal with the fruit, but we're not at the end. We're only just beginning, because now we're going to have a wine tasting. We're going to taste wines that come to us from the time of the Renaissance that Michelangelo and his papal friends and his Medici friends all knew and all savored, and we get to taste them today. So, Julian, let's have friends join us, and we'll begin to taste the wine. So, welcome everyone. I trust you have your food at hand. I trust you have some wine at hand. And also, I hope you did take a moment to consult the etiquette tips from the Renaissance about how one should, how one should eat and drink at that time. This was not just about good table manners, but frankly about not spreading disease. One of them, no scratching your body at the table. I still don't do that today. No sniffing each other's wines because you don't want to put your nose in someone else's glass. And I love the injunction, do not share your pears. They didn't say don't share your food, your fruit. Don't share your pears. So absolutely, everybody should have their own pear. How's that? Now, let's start with the first wine that Michelangelo would have known and that we can easily drink today. It's Frascati, in this case, the Principe Pallavicini Frascati Superiore. And Frascati is the name of a town just outside of Rome in an area called the Castelli Romani, the Roman hills, the Roman castles. And these are beautiful towns, many of which were owned by the popes and had wineries, but also had palaces where the popes would go for the summer to get away from the heat of Rome. And all the people of Rome drank this wine. It was not a fancy wine, but it was a delicious, basic wine. Now, I'm going to talk a bit about how we taste any wines. I know many of you know that, but for the few of you who don't, let's basically go through this. What you do is you regard the wine. In other words, what color is it? It doesn't quite matter as long as it doesn't look unpleasant to you. But to me, for example, this is a slightly straw color. To me, it reminds me of marigolds, which is a nice connotation, a nice association for me. And before we smell it, I should tell you what the grapes are. I think that's important as well, because a lot of people think nowadays that every wine is made of a single grape. Actually, that's not true. There are many blends. For example, Chianti is a blend, Bordeaux is a blend, in addition to single 100% grapes, such as Pinot Noir, Merlot that we might, or Cabernet Sauvignon, or Chardonnay. But for many people, blends are preferable. And the reason very simply is, what if you have more of one grape in a given harvest and less of another? You blend them to make a wine. And this particular Frascati is made of Malvasia del Lazio, 70%. Malvasia is a general grape name that's found in much of Italy, but we know that the origin of Malvasia grapes was in Greece. Before the Roman Empire, much of southern Italy and central Italy was occupied by the Greeks, and therefore they brought grapes to Italy because grapes grew incredibly well there. In fact, for the Greeks, it was known as Enotria, land of wine. So they brought Malvasia. They also probably brought Trebbiano. Trebbiano is 15% of this wine, and you find Trebbiano in various places in Italy. And then the third grape, another 15%, is called Greco, which means Greek. So obviously, that was a Greek grape. So in effect, we have history all in one glass. And I like the Greco because it gives characteristic fragrance notes, such as peach and herbalness like cut grass. But let's see what we find here. You swirl the wine a little bit in the glass. You inhale with your mouth shut. Get more that way with both nostrils. And then try the left, try the right. You might get different sensations in each nostril, and then try them together. And what I'm getting is, in fact, a peachiness. I do get a sense of cut grass and very pleasant. Also, again, that bit of marigold. Maybe I have a thing for marigolds. Now, how to taste it. You put a little sip in your mouth. You put it on the tip of your tongue. You raise it up to the roof of your mouth and let it diffuse against the palate. And you'll notice you're getting taste and smell in the nose and mouth. Let it touch your cheeks, the tongue, all over the mouth before swallowing that bit. In the mouth, I'm getting a bit of pineapple, a little bit of, I would say, honeydew melon. This is not to say that there are pineapples and honeydew that are added to the wine, but very simply, the polyphenols, which are the elements that make a wine and give flavor and fragrance, also exist in other fruits. And sometimes we use in defining wines associations with fruit, with flowers, with other elements as a means of describing it. So I know that you have your own association as well. Let us now go to the second wine, which is a magnificent wine called Carmignano. Carmignano was very likely the wine, Carmignano was very likely the wine that was at the Medici table. And the reason for that is that the Medicis had a lot of exchange with the French royal family. In fact, one of them, Catherine de' Medici, the great granddaughter of Lorenzo, married into the French royal family, became Queen of France, and she brought a lot of Italian food and traditions, and is said the use of the fork to France. But she also arranged to have certain French grapes sent to Italy, to Tuscany specifically, and among them was Cabernet Sauvignon. So rather unique for an old Italian wine. This is 80% Sangiovese, which is the typical Tuscan grape, but 20% Cabernet Sauvignon. And let's do what we did with the others. Let's regard the wine. I see a sort of brick color to it, which is not a bad thing at all. It's sort of a cherry red, I would say. Then smell, both nostrils, then one each. And I'm getting red cherry, which, as I love cherries the way Michelangelo loved pears, that's a good thing. Red cherry, a little bit of red raspberry, red fruit. Interestingly, there's a freshness that reminds me of watermelon, which also is a very nice thing. And there's another flavor note in the nose, at least, I don't know about the mouth, orange peel. Think about it, not an orange, but the orange peel. If you pull it off and let it dry a bit, it has a very distinct and to me very pleasing fragrance. So now let's sip it. Again, red cherry, definitely, incredibly pleasingly. A little bit of red raspberry. I don't quite get the watermelon in the mouth, but I'm getting really the cherry and the raspberry. And this would go beautifully with pasta, with Tuscan meats. The Tuscans love beef, they love lamb, and they love goat actually to eat. And therefore, that would be a very pleasing combination. This is a wonderful, underappreciated wine, is Carmignano. Now, finally, let's get our third glass. This is a very, very unusual wine. It's called Sagrantino. And if you think about how that sounds, it's sacramental wine. In other words, it was used in church services when communion was given. And like so many fascinating Italian wines, it only comes from one town. In this case, the town of Montefalco in Umbria, and it's grown just next door in a little town called Bevagna. But basically, you only find it there. And Carmignano is similar that way. And this is what I love in Italy. It's a nation that has nearly 2,000 wines. And therefore, we can travel the whole country, Enotria, as we still call it, and discover these wines and understand that most of them have remarkable histories to them. But one of the most remarkable of all, in my view, is Sagrantino from Montefalco. And originally it was so intense, so rich, when you took communion that a little sip and you'd sort of get woozy. It had a very high alcohol content. Additionally, the problem was, if you look at the color, it was so dark that when the wine sometimes spilled on the marble floors of these churches and onto the altars, they would stain and you could not get the wine out of the marble. So they stopped using Sagrantino at a certain point, and it became a very rare wine until in recent years, it came back in a slightly lighter version, though it's still quite intense, that is a drinking wine, definitely to go with food. And it is 100% Sagrantino grape, as I said. It is a very dark, very intense color, which I find very pleasing. Let's swirl it and smell it. What I get most distinctly, think about a ripe blackberry. You bite into a blackberry, and one by one, those little tiny pods explode in your mouth, and you get these injections of flavor. That is what this reminds me of. A bit of black cherry, not red cherry, as I mentioned for the Carmignano. Also, interestingly, notes of chocolate, and I don't mean sweet chocolate, I don't mean milk chocolate, I mean just powdered chocolate. And also there's a hint of the sort of bright fruitiness of strawberry. The more you sniff, the more you'll notice things. And one more thing, sometimes we get an herbiness, and you could say grasses, you could say rosemary. I love thyme, and I'm getting a very distinct little fragrance of thyme in this. Now, let's swirl it, have a small sip so we don't pass out. It's very persistent. That's a good thing. That means it has a long finish in the mouth. Touch of blackberry, yes, but the black cherry comes to me more in the mouth. That hint of chocolate, and again, thyme. Less strawberry somehow, it was more in the nose. But the thyme is a very pleasing thing. And this wine we could serve nowadays, as they would have in the Renaissance, with pasta that might have Umbrian truffles on it, butter, Parmigiano cheese. Parmigiano, we know, goes back at least 700 years. And although it's from Parma, it traveled throughout much of the Italian peninsula. So they would have known it certainly at the tables of the Medicis and in Rome. So that concludes, Julian, our talk about Michelangelo, about his world, about his preferences, about food and wine. And I invite all of you to raise a glass in his honor. And Julian and I both thank you so much. Salute.